Hey guys, welcome back here to Harvest.247. We're so glad you decided to join us whenever and wherever you may be watching. We appreciate you making us part of your day, not our day, but your day. And if you would, just click that subscribe button down there. We would love for you to subscribe. You can also go to Harvest.247 on Facebook and Instagram. Love for you to follow, like, all the various things for social media. Also, you can go to Behind the Harvest podcast as well. You can check out some episodes on about Behind the Harvest podcast, what it's like behind the scenes of church planting, and also maybe some things on the end times. We'd love for you to go check it out. Last week, we started a series called More to the Story. And one of the things that we're going to do during this series is we're going to talk a little bit about some of our core values. We're going to talk about some of the things that we believe about church culture and things like that. And so the idea is that there's always more to the story than what you may see or what you may have grown up believing or whatnot. And if you are watching this and you're not a believer, maybe we can give you a little bit more to the story of what it is for church, worship, all those types of things. Well, today we are going to talk about worship. And here's the thing. One of the only things we get to choose is who or what we worship. It's one of the only things we get to choose. We don't have a whole lot of say about what happens around us in our life. We just get a choice over some very few things. And one of the only things that we get to choose is who or what we're going to worship. Now, if you are a person who is a churchgoer, I'm not talking to you about worshiping when you hear your favorite song or not worshiping when you don't like the song that's chosen. I'm not talking about worshiping when the volume of the music is kind of the volume that you would like. You know, if it's too loud, I'm not going to worship. If it's just right, then I might worship. And I'm not even talking about choosing to worship when you're in a good mood or when you've had a good week versus when you come into church and when you're worshiping when you have not had such a bad day. I'm not talking about any of those. What I'm talking about when I talk about worship as a decision, I'm talking about the conscious decision that you and I make every day to determine if an object has meaning or not. So that's what we do. We determine every single day if an item has meaning or not. And this is how I've defined worship very simply, our decision to give value. Every single day, our decision to give value. And the way that we give value to something is with our time. Oftentimes, it's the most precious thing that we have. And so when we give our time to something, what we are saying is that is valuable. It's important. Another is our attention. When we give our attention to something, we're saying that is important. And when we're not giving our attention to things, we're saying that that is less important. And of course, our money. Where we spend our money is a really good barometer of what we place value in. So just a quick example. If you have a really nice house or you have a house and you spend a lot of time in the yard, a lot of money in the yard, all of those types of things, you're valuing your lawn, you're valuing the outward appearance. As opposed to if you have a car and you spend more time on the car and it's always clean or whatnot, but we might go to your house and it's not as always clean, you're just giving value to your car. So I'm not saying either one of those is bad, just using as an example. So when we talk about worship, it is our decision to give value to something. Now, we always have a decision to make when we're talking about what we're going to worship and who we're going to worship. And there's a story that has really resonated with me and stuck with me. We had a friend of ours, her name was Ann, and her dad was at a job for over 20-something years. And that job laid her father off. They just said, hey, you no longer have a job here. Now, that is a very difficult news for anybody to hear. And if you're in one of those situations where you've heard that, it's really, really hard. It's been very hard for me when I have heard that. But they did not have a job. And so what happened is that in that moment, he had a decision. And he had a decision to choose who or what he was going to worship. He had a decision in that moment to choose where he was going to place value. And so what he did is instead of sulking and, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And I'm going to get on Job Finder and all this kind of stuff. So what he decided to do is have a party. He was going to throw a party. And that's an amazing thing because he said, look, God has been faithful to me for 20 years. And now I'm about to throw a party and I'm going to worship him for what he's about to do. Because he's transitioned me out of one place, so that means he has something new for me. In that moment, he chose to place value in a person, not necessarily in a job or position or provision. And you and I face these decisions all of the time. We face the decisions of where we're going to place value. We have these decisions of what we are going to value. Where are we going to give our time and our attention and our money? And a lot of times those are very, very difficult decisions, and they're bigger decisions than just, am I going to get this at the grocery store or this at the grocery store? They're bigger decisions. It's what am I going to give my life to and what am I going to value? Well, there's a story from a man named Joshua in Joshua 24, and he shows us that worship actually is not a style, it is a decision. That worshiping something has nothing to do with its style. What it sounds like, how high the pitch is, how loud the music is, do I like the song or not? That has nothing to do with worship. It's everything to do with the decision. And this is what Joshua says in Joshua 24, 14 through 15. This is what it says. Now, therefore, the fear of the Lord and serve him in sincerity and truth. So Joshua is talking to the people of Israel. And do away with the gods which your fathers served beyond the Euphrates River and Egypt, and serve the Lord. In verse 15, but if it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your father served, which were beyond the Euphrates River, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Now that is that last phrase. If I were to walk into some people's homes that follow Jesus, I would probably see that phrase in some people's homes, maybe on a desk, on a counter, hanging on a wall. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And so what Joshua is showing us here is that worship isn't a style, it is a decision. But when we think about that decision and we think about what that means, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, one of the things that we oftentimes miss is what are the things that we're going to have to stop worshiping in order to choose and make the decision to worship the Lord. Because as my wife likes to say, when you choose one thing, you say no to the other. And so when we're trying to live our life and worship someone, we're choosing who or what we will worship. When we say yes to one thing, we're going to have to say no to another. And some of the things that we have to say no to are embedded in this story that we would not just get out of, just reading it. We have to kind of dive deeper. So we're going to dive deeper into this story a little bit, and I'm going to give you a couple of references because he begins to use rivers and places and things, and those rivers and those places actually mean something when it comes to some things that we're going to have to contend with when we are choosing to worship. Joshua 24, 2 through 4 shows that on the other side of the Euphrates were the gods of Sumerian and Babylonian culture, meaning they were the gods of heritage. So heritage is something that is handed down from the past. It is a tradition. So when Joshua is talking to the people of Israel, he's saying, listen, there are some traditional gods, there's some traditional cultures, some Sumerian and Babylonian cultures that we have to choose not to worship in order to actually fully worship the Lord. And so for some people, we have to stop worshiping the gods of heritage or the gods of tradition. Now, there's a difference in honoring heritage and worshiping it. One of the things that we want to recognize is that we stand on the shoulders of so many people that have come before us and sacrificed for us. And so we want to honor them. And the way we want to honor them is by following Jesus in the way that he's called us to do today and in the future so that we can continue that heritage. However, we want to ensure that our honoring does not turn into worshiping the methods by which those previous generations used to advance the kingdom and to worship God. Joshua says to do away with default tradition of worshiping the gods of Sumerian and Babylonian culture. He's saying, listen, do away with the worship of heritage. In a sense, stop watering the dead plants. And I believe a lot of times that our relationships with the Lord become stagnant and they become less meaningful because we're trying to worship God today in the way that people worship God yesterday. We try to make what happened yesterday more of set in stone and not just another process as we're following Jesus. And so one of the things that we have to choose when we talk about worship isn't a style and it's a decision is we have to choose not to worship the gods of the heritage, the worship of the gods of tradition. When we read scripture, one of the things that we want to do is we want to see that God chooses people to serve him in new ways all throughout scripture. He does not have one way that he calls people to serve him. He asked Moses to stretch out his arms and he parted the sea. He did not go to Joshua and say, spread out your arms and I'm gonna make you walk on dry land and I'm gonna spread the sea. And then go to Daniel, spread out your arms and I'm gonna make you walk through the sea. He always shifts and changes. He's always inventing new ways to stretch our faith in how we follow him. So, one of the things, if we're going to truly worship the Lord, is that we have to do away with the gods of heritage, the gods of tradition, and make the decision to choose to worship God and follow him in the ways of today. Because you cannot bring old methods into new ways of following Jesus. So what Joshua is saying to the nation of Israel is like, look guys, you got to do away with that form of thinking. The Sumerian and Babylonian cultures, the gods of heritage that have been in this area for a long time, you got to do away from that form of worship and you got to serve the Lord in the way that he's calling you to do today. Because worship isn't a style. It is a decision. Secondly, Joshua 24:5-7 shows us that on the other side of the Red Sea were the gods of ancient Egypt. These are the gods of upbringing, meaning these are the gods that the Israelites many generations grew up in Egypt under slavery. So they were shown a specific way by which they are to worship. It's the gods of their upbringing, right? So therefore, many Egyptian customs were prevalent in Israelite worship. Don't you think that, right? Don't you think that if you were taught a certain way to worship, that the Israelites are trying to bring in Egyptian cultures and Egyptian customs in order to worship the God of Yahweh. One of the things that we have to recognize is just because it's our upbringing doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually biblically right. That doesn't mean that your parents were awful. Doesn't mean your grandparents were awful. It doesn't mean that. Maybe some of them were, and for that, I'm really sad for you and sad that you had to grow up in that situation. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the way you were brought up was necessarily inherently bad. It just means that we cannot always worship the way that we were brought up. We have to read scripture and understand what is biblically true. I'm going to give you an example. I remember the first time that I preached in a pair of jeans. And my dad wasn't very happy about that because after all, you always grew up and the pastor wore a suit and a tie. And I'm like, but Dad, you don't have to wear a suit and tie to preach the word, but that's how you were brought up. That's how you were taught. And what I had to do in those moments is just lean back and say, you know what? Here's what I believe about scripture. I don't believe you have to wear a certain thing in order to preach it. And therefore, I know that's how I was brought up. And that's not inherently bad. It's just not something that I have to make a principle in my life. As God begins to grow me and reveal new things to me, I don't have to make the principles back there in my life. There's certainly principles, yes ma'am, no ma'am, respect, honor, all those things that I bring in from my upbringing, even into my children. But one of the things we have to do is be willing to say and willing to challenge the gods of our upbringing so that we can find and follow Jesus and do what he's asking us to do in this day. Why? Because worship isn't a style, it is a decision. Joshua 24:7-13 and 24:15 shows us that as they crossed the Jordan, there were the gods of the Amorites, meaning the gods of the culture. Now, when we talk about culture, it's the prevailing culture that we live in. It's the day in and day out. And I believe that there's 3 gods of our culture. One of them is availability. Availability is no one has it. We schedule ourselves to death. We are always busy. We were always strung out. We're always moving. I'm going to give you some examples of that. Working and climbing the ladder. Trying to continue to climb the ladder and continue to climb the ladder and having our eyes focused on that. And so we overschedule ourselves at work, or we commit too much to that, and we don't have time for anything else, much less following the Lord. Youth sports. I was talking to a lady the other day about her son. She's like, they were playing travel ball, and it wasn't really that much. It was just 2 nights a week and all through the weekend. And I'm like, that's not too much. Are you kidding me? Like 2 nights a week and Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, that's 5 days out of your week that you're given to baseball, right? And so we have these things that we feel like vacations, and we got to do this and we got to do that, and we got to be involved in this, and we got to go to that club and that thing, and da, 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 da. And so we have this availability issue that we schedule ourselves to death, and we have no availability, no freedom, no rest, no quietness to seek and to follow and to hear God. The second one is applicability. We don't do it. When we go and it's like we hear a good sermon. That's a God of our culture, especially in the Christian world. Oh man, that was a great word. Oh man, that was a great sermon. And not one time do we think about how are we going to apply it to our life? How are we actually going to walk this out? How are we actually going to live this out? Right? We don't. Because guess what? It's a great sermon. Oh, I go to this church. Oh, I heard this thing over here. I did this, and so we don't apply it. And the third thing, and I think this is probably one of the biggest gods of our culture, is accountability. Nobody wants it. After all, especially in the West, and especially in America, we pull ourselves up from our bootstraps. That's what we do. How dare you tell me this? How dare you tell me that? How dare you hold me accountable? How dare you question me on this? How dare you ask me to change? How dare you expect me to do more? How dare you? Because when you do that, I'm just going to get up and go. So we live a life where we don't want any accountability for our feelings, for our philosophical beliefs, for any of those things. We don't want it. And so the gods of the culture is something that we have to wrestle with. The idea that we've got to climb the ladder and be so busy so that our life is full, except for we're all stressed out all the time. This idea that, you know what? I can hear a great sermon and be like, oh man, that was a great sermon. It made me feel good. But as far as walking it out and applying it to my life, I don't have to do that. And this idea of accountability, how dare you hold me accountable and tell me and bring correction when actually it's very good for us. And so what we see in the backdrop here that Joshua is trying to say to the Israelites just in these couple of verses, I mean, they're loaded, is that look, worship isn't a style, it's a decision. And you and your household are going to have to make a decision. Are you going to worship God? Are you going to worship the Lord? Are you going to worship the gods of heritage? Are you going to worship the Lord? Are you going to worship the God of your upbringing? Are you going to allow some things from your upbringing to hold you back from worshiping God fully now? And the gods of the culture. Are you going to give into the culture? Or are you going to make the decision to stand apart from the culture and live a life that's filled with meaning and joy, an extraordinary mission that God calls you into? And then Joshua applied this principle in verse 15 back to his family. He said this, but if it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, meaning if it's disagreeable, if you're listening to this and it's disagreeable, no, I'm serving that, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, fine. He said, if it's disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose yourselves today whom you will serve, whether it be the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the Euphrates River, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. He said, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. He said, I'm not responsible for what you choose to do. As a pastor, I'm not responsible for what y'all choose to do. But for me and my house, we are going to serve the Lord. As for me and my house, we're going to give our lives to something that goes beyond this life. As for me and my house, we're going to give our life to Jesus. As for me and my house, we're going to serve Him wholeheartedly, not perfectly, but wholeheartedly. As for me and my house, we're going to choose to put away those things and try to keep those other things out of the picture as much as we possibly can, the gods of the culture, the gods of heritage, the gods of upbringing, and we're going to fully go after serving the Lord and running the race like Paul said. When I was a bartender, and it's kind of funny to use these, hey, when I was a bartender as a pastor, it's fun to do that. I met a girl who worked for us, and she would come to me, and of course everybody knew at that point that I wanted to be a pastor, and that after I graduated college I was going to go to seminary and all that kind of thing. And she said, what do I do with my husband who will not get out of bed and go to church? She's like, I don't know what to do. And I said, you know what you do? You get up and you go to church without him. That's what you do. You make the decision that I'm going to worship regardless if you lay in the bed. I'm going to make the decision to get up and worship and go seek after the Lord regardless of how you live your life. I'm going to do it. And I said, here's the deal. You know what I bet? I bet after doing that a few times, he's going to start getting up and going with you. And guess what happened? That's exactly what happened. You have a responsibility, and I have a responsibility to lay a foundation and an example for the future generations and the other people in our family. And whatever we choose to worship, we're going to set that example. If we choose to worship the gods of heritage, the gods of our upbringing, the gods of culture, guess what? Other people are going to fall into that as well. When you as a parent make church a choice, your children are going to learn they can do the same thing. When you say to your kids, well, during travel ball season, we're going to do that, but when it's convenient, we're going to go to church. Guess what? They will make it a choice as well. But when you teach them, no, we're going to serve Jesus, and we're going to choose to worship him, and we're going to put all these other things off to the side, guess what? They will also follow suit, because they're going to understand worship isn't a style, it's a decision. We all have that decision to make. Joshua chose to fight against the Amalekites, choosing when it might have cost everything. Joshua chose to reject the golden calf, choosing when the flesh might have been satisfied. Joshua chose to serve the Lord by serving Moses, choosing a humble place. Joshua chose to believe God's promise about the promised land, choosing against the majority. Joshua chose to recognize the leadership of the captain of the Lord's army, choosing surrender to God. And Joshua chose to take leadership of Israel and lead them into the land, choosing faith instead of unbelief. And so the question is this: who are you going to choose to worship? Because worship is not a style, it is a decision. We'll see you next time.